with this disease is certainly not gone away, and cases in the ONS infection survey, that prevalence survey, have gone up slightly over the last week. So we're not out of it yet. However, the government around the UK are looking ahead and saying, how do you plan for a more sustainable future? And that means they're balancing out different risks, the risk from the virus to individuals, the risk to the health service, but they're also thinking about the educational, social and economic impacts.
This video is called Live.
Things in place indefinitely when the situation stabilises.
End of pandemic.
So I imagine, although not all of
UK
the
2022
parts of the country are going to be shifting at the same time, it does seem the right time to open things up. We're going to see a plan from the UK government, I think around the 20th, 21st of February, up here in Scotland, a strategic framework just after that. And that will really give people who are vulnerable advice about what to expect, and also for everybody in society, what will happen for the next few months, which we hope will be really stable. But then if we have an uptick in future or outbreaks, how do we deal with that? And many countries around the world are making these tricky decisions.
Chris, much criticism has been levied about the scientific advice that was received, particularly before Christmas.
Yeah, I agree.
Some said scaremongering when it was looking at how
that was a bit scaremongering. Aye.
Restrictions weren't maintained, sustained. And now there's criticism about what's the scientific advice behind this. And we're seeing the four nations go about the strategy of opening up very differently. What scientific advice is there at this moment in time for people to feel reassured that we're moving in the right direction?
A really good thing to look at is how many people are going into hospital and how is that changing? When people go into hospital, are they severely unwell with coronavirus, or are they in hospital with something else and they're diagnosed with coronavirus, so they're there with coronavirus not because of it? And people who are severely unwell, are they sufficiently unwell to be going to intensive care? Because those sorts of measures can give us a feel for the direction of travel of the virus. What sort of impact is it making on us? What sort of impact is it making on the NHS? What sort of impact is it having when people catch the infection? Is it severe? Is it mild? Now, the really good news is that all of those metrics are going in the right direction, not just as a blip, but in a sustained, trending downwards way. The numbers of cases are falling on average. The number of cases that are severe are definitely falling. The number of people who are in intensive care is lower now than it has been for a considerable period of time. So that gives us encouragement that we're dealing with a population that seem to be quite resilient against the infection, probably because of the impact of vaccination and a natural immunity acquired through people catching the infection or having their immunity reinforced by infection. But also the fact that we've got people who are probably showing that they can respond responsibly. And when the government says they're going to remove these requirements, actually we're talking about legal requirements to do things. We're not talking about saying to people, throw caution to the wind and behave irresponsibly. I think what the government is saying is we're going to remove the legal requirements for people to behave in certain ways. But as we saw with Christmas, when information was provided to people, people were responsible, they changed their behaviour accordingly, and actually the outcomes have been good ones.
We just have to live with it.
It is a risk. Response to a changing and fluid situation. The disease situation we confront now is very different than it was a year ago.
Chris, I'm going to start with this question from Veronica.
That's what it is.
She asks, how safe or not is going to the theatre? And bear in mind that conversations we've been having about the relaxations, there will be more people. A lot of people have already gone to the cinema or theatre, but there will be more doing that, less restrictions around it. Just take us through, you know, sitting in a theatre and COVID has not gone away.
Interesting idea.
Everybody's risk is different because everybody is different. There will be different people of different ages, different previous medical histories, therefore different susceptibilities, who do different things and are therefore exposed to a greater or lesser extent and therefore to a greater or lesser risk. When you go out and about, you are of course increasing your risk of anything happening to you because you can never de-risk any particular situation. This is a respiratory infection, so if you go where there are lots of people, of course there's a chance you may run into it. And if you're in an enclosed space that's poorly ventilated, there's a higher likelihood you might run into it. But if you do run into it, what's the likelihood you're going to have a severe problem? Well, if you're not in poor health, if you have fulfilled your vaccine obligations and been boosted, you've pretty much done everything you can to minimise your risk. And if you are in good health, on average, in general, then actually your risk is really pretty low anyway. So I would say the risk to people's mental ill health or mental well-being if not going out, not maintaining those social contacts, not
He's
having
right.
a life, is probably beginning to be greater than the risk of if you catch what is amounting to cold and flu-like symptoms for the vast majority of people who now catch the infection. So I would say it's a reasonable balancing act that we're now on.
Well, Linda, let's pick up on that with Stanley Gordon-Johnson,
After isolate for 10 days,
question,
no
asking, will
picnic
the
for
over
me.
70s get another booster to give them more protection? I know we've touched on it before, but that, you know, particularly with the theme of people feeling vulnerable, or whether or not the booster actually is as effective.
It's my friend
right
Rory
now.
is 70 years old.
Good question from Stanley. Just to go back to Victoria's question briefly, there's a scheme called See It Safely that many of the theatres around the UK have signed up to. So if Veronica wants to go and look at the theatre she's going to visit and the See It Safely mark, which is about ventilation, cleaning, etc., she can have a look at that. But on to Stanley's question. The idea of another booster after a third dose, or indeed it'll be a fourth dose for those who are immunocompromised or immunosuppressed, isn't currently being recommended in the UK. The JCVI looked at all the evidence not that long ago, but they're keeping it under close review. Now we can look to another country, Israel, that has rolled out a fourth dose to people over the age of 60. And what they found was quite interesting. Israel now seems to have got past the peak of Omicron, which is good, and there's fewer people in hospital, but they didn't see such an antibody response to the fourth dose in an early study, a small study with healthcare workers, as they did after the third dose. So there may be some signs that booster wasn't perhaps as needed as they might have thought, but I'm sure it's contributing now to Israel getting out of this difficult wave. I guess we need to wait to hear from the JCVI. A likely scenario is that we won't be boosting everybody every 6 months. That's not only logistically difficult, it's also very expensive. But I think as we head into perhaps the autumn or another time of year, we might see people who are more vulnerable offered another dose. I think that's
about
highly
right.
likely, a bit like we do with the influenza, the flu vaccine.
Chris, your thoughts? You know, we've been reporting today that children, teenagers, can now travel to Spain if they show a PCR test, if they're not vaccinated, a PCR test within 72 hours of arriving. How do you think that's going to reflect, you know, half terms coming up, more travel? I mean, is that a flashpoint? Is that something to be concerned about? Will that be looked at
here we go.
It'll certainly be looked at closely, and the rates of disease will be monitored. We've effectively got a giant virological radar screen running all around the world now, where countries are reporting cases, but they're also reporting variants. We're reading the genetic code of the viruses that are popping up in different places. And this enables us to keep track of who's got what infections where. And it means that things like Omicron can be spotted promptly. Remember, it was spotted in South Africa and very quickly reported around the world, and the data was shared.
It was.
So actually, I think travel is probably lower risk at the moment, partly because if you're healthy already, you're probably not going to travel if you're unhealthy. So automatically you're in a healthier group. And as long as people are responsible while they're away, I don't regard this as a major threat. Obviously, if you're worried about a particular variant in a particular geography, if that was spotted, that would be different. But with us all sharing largely Omicron infections at the moment, then I think the risk really posed by travel is no greater than the risk of travelling in our own country.
Chris, I'm going to put this question to you with a strong air of caution around it in relation to Lassa fever, because we know there has been one patient in Bedfordshire, just one patient who has died from a confirmed case. We understand it's the third case to be confirmed in recent days. I guess inevitably, because of what we've been going through recently, as soon as you hear that, people will be asking questions, wanting to know more.
Oh no, not another virus. Great.
Well, I have been dealing with this situation this week. And Lassa fever is a member of a family of viruses called the viral hemorrhagic fevers. And actually, it sounds alarming, but Ebola is part of the same family of infections. These are infections which stem from parts of Africa, in this case, West Africa. They're carried actually by animals, and people who are out in the bush and exposed to excrement from these animals or urine, so the body fluids of these rodents actually can spread the infection to people who are exposed. But it has quite a long incubation period, and in the majority of cases, it's a very mild illness. And that meant that a traveller from our country who was in Africa came home and didn't realise they were carrying the infection. And the cluster of cases we've seen are all within one family. So it's not that we've got widespread community infections. We've got transmission within a family unit, unfortunately with one fatal casualty. But really what we're doing now is making sure that all the healthcare workers who've been involved in looking after those people haven't themselves picked up the infection. And we don't expect there will be onward transmission, but we need to be sure that there hasn't. And so there's a lot of screening going on to make sure those people are safe and that they're not going to transmit it if they have picked it up to anybody else. But we think at the moment the risk of that happening is very low.
Well, that is reassuring. You know, what I will say, Chris and Linda, is over the past, nearly 2 years, you've been constant and reassuring all the time, and just delivering.
You like this video?
So for that,
please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to my channel on Sunny Joes, and the force be with you. Thanks for watching. Bye, everyone.